Many consider the immigrant maid Grace Marks to be the devil in female form, but is this really the case? Perhaps this poor woman has been falsely accused, or maybe she is simply ill. The events begin in Kingston Penitentiary in 1859. Grace Marks has been an inmate of this prison for 15 years. She was convicted of a horrific crime. Every day Grace is taken to the prison governor's house, supposedly to help with household chores. In reality, Grace is an exhibit for curious eyes. Guests love to observe the woman who has become a notorious murderess. Now Grace's life consists of confinement in her prison cell and visits to the prison governor's house. Dr. Simon Jordan boarded a train to Kingston. He is far from the first doctor asked to examine Grace. Perhaps his report will help her obtain a pardon. Grace has gone through this many times before, but it has never led to anything. There is a small chance that Dr. Jordan will find answers that eluded others. Accompanying the doctor to the cell, the guard warned him that he should be careful because Grace might be dangerous. Simon Jordan first politely greeted Grace and introduced himself. Usually Grace is afraid of doctors, but unlike all the previous ones, Simon immediately gained her trust. When Simon handed Grace an apple, she thought about the freedom she had possibly lost forever. Right now Grace would give anything for an apple pie. Simon explained that he is a doctor, but he studies not the diseases of the body, but the diseases of the mind. Grace said that she would not return to the mental hospital. It was much worse than imprisonment in the jail. Simon is here to listen to Grace and try to help her. Grace remembers nothing about the day she took her employer's life, but perhaps together they can restore her memory. Since Simon's interest was purely scientific, Grace decided to take the risk. Simon promised her that she would not be sent back to the mental hospital, but for this, she must control her outbursts of rage. The therapy will begin tomorrow. After saying goodbye to Grace, Simon left. For the first time in many years, Grace ate something other than water and bread. In the morning, the female prison inmates ate their meager breakfast. The guards are harsh with the prisoners and punish them for the slightest infraction. Simon had lunch at a tavern with Reverend Verringer, who is striving to obtain a pardon for Grace Marks. When she was sentenced, she was too young and vulnerable. Since then Grace has been behind bars. Simon had already reviewed the trial report and found inconsistencies. For instance, during her arrest, Grace claimed she didn't see Nancy Montgomery on that fateful day, but at the trial, she stated she saw James McDermott throw her into the cellar. There are also McDermott's statements taken before his execution. He insisted that it was Grace who was the instigator of the crime, not him. McDermott often changed his testimony, so no one believed him. The Reverend expressed hope that in his report, Dr. Jordan would be favorable to Grace. Simon said he would like to meet Grace in a more comfortable setting. The Reverend said that Grace used to help with chores at the prison governor's house, but her hysteria during the last doctor's visit scared the family. Simon asked Reverend Verringer to persuade them to let Grace back into their house. He promised to do his best. The prison governor's wife likes Grace, and besides, she piques the curiosity of the ladies in the spiritualist circle. The Reverend and the doctor agreed on everything. The next day, Grace was taken to the prison governor's house. On the way, the guards joked that the new doctor would quickly run away from this mad woman. During her meeting with Simon Jordan, Grace didn't know what the psychiatrist wanted to hear from her. Simon asked her not to think about what he wanted to hear. He preferred to listen to her true story, and to lighten the mood, asked her to talk about the quilt she was sewing right now. Grace said she was sewing it for the prison governor's daughter. It would be her wedding dowry. Grace compared a quilt to a flag that is spread on the bed as a warning. It is there that many terrible things, including death, often happen in a person's life. The doctor found it curious that the patient considered a bed a dangerous place. When Simon picked up a bead and asked Grace what it reminded her of, she remembered Nancy Montgomery being thrown into the cellar. But the girl lied that the beat reminded her of Sunday dinner. When asked about her personal desires, Grace replied that it is dangerous to speak such things aloud, and Mary Whitney, Grace's friend from the past, is an example of that. The doctor wants to know if Grace considers her fate unjust. Women who commit such brutal crimes are extremely rare, so as a warning to others, the court sentenced Grace not to execution but to life imprisonment. The girl did not give a direct answer to the question of whether she was guilty. Grace only said that it no longer matters because society considers her guilty. Simon has Grace's confession, which according to the girl herself, has nothing to do with reality. It is what she was forced to say at the trial, and the press picked it up. When Grace was on the run, she used the name Mary Whitney. That was the name of her best and only friend, who had long since passed away. Grace remembers Mary fondly. No one else had been so kind to her. The doctor asked Grace to start telling her story from the very beginning. Grace was born in the north of Ireland. Her family was of Protestant faith. They left Ireland in a hurry due to religious conflicts in the country. Standing on the ship's deck next to her brothers and sisters, Grace thought that if two of them fell overboard, there would be fewer hungry mouths. Grace loved her brothers and sisters but wanted to protect them from such a life by any means. Seeing 3 crows in the sky, the mother said it was a bad omen and that she would perish at sea. And so it happened. The father was drunk throughout the journey, but the family was even glad about this because there was enough suffering without him. Many were seasick, the ship was infested with rats, and icy water constantly flooded the hold. The journey was supposed to last 8 weeks. It was hard for Dr. Jordan to listen to this. Grace compared that ship to filthy slums. The passengers were both Catholics and Protestants, but in those conditions they could not afford to feud. Grace's mother was constantly coughing and had pain. The eldest daughter took care of her but could not significantly ease her suffering. The ship's doctor examined the woman and concluded that she most likely had a tumor. The doctor was powerless to do anything. Unable to bear the stinking air, he hurried to leave. Grace didn't leave her mother's side. One day the woman quietly passed away in her sleep. Grace was in despair, but a woman among the passengers supported her. She said that they needed to open the window to let the soul out. Now Grace's mother is in heaven, in a better world. Pulling herself together, Grace took care of everything and told her sisters and brothers to kiss their mother goodbye. The ship's priest held a brief funeral service, after which the body was consigned to the deep sea. Grace cried, thinking that her mother's soul would remain trapped on this ship forever, in the midst of the cold, cruel ocean. In the present, Grace said at that time she was still too young and didn't understand much. The doctor asked her to continue. Grace said that a few weeks later her family arrived in Toronto, where very different people lived side by side. This was new to Grace. The father drank heavily and was often cruel. He used to take out all his anger on the wife, but now Grace took over that role. The younger siblings lived in constant fear. One day when her father fell asleep, Grace picked up a heavy cauldron and approached the bed, but in the end she didn't do it. Despite her burning hatred, the girl didn't want to take on such a terrible sin. Soon the father told his eldest daughter that it was time for her to work and bring her wages home. The other children would be looked after by the middle sister Katie. Grace didn't want to leave her family, but she had no choice. Gathering her few belongings, she hugged her brothers and sisters and then left the house. In the present, Grace told the doctor that she was tired and wanted to continue tomorrow. But Simon asked her to tell him more about Mary Whitney. Grace said that this was a happier chapter of her life. Finding a job in a wealthy house in Toronto, Grace met another maid, Mary, who helped her settle in the new place. Mary was a very cheerful and sociable girl. She showed Grace all the rooms in the Parkinson's house, told her about the owners and introduced her to the other servants. One of the maids, Effie, was very sad because her fiancé was exiled from the country for participating in the rebellion. Soon after, he perished. Fate was also unfair to Mary. Government troops burned down her family's house. Her father fled into the forest where he froze to death. Mary's mother couldn't bear the grief and also passed away. But Mary didn't lose heart, believing that one day justice would prevail for people like her. The girls shared a room. Grace told Mary that she would send all her wages to her father. Grace knew that he would drink away the money, but she couldn't leave her brothers and sisters destitute. Mary advised the new friend not to send her wages home. The children wouldn't get anything anyway. Grace was safe here, and could not be afraid of her father. The girl is glad that she has found a true friend. In the present, Grace and Dr. Jordan agreed to continue tomorrow. At night in her cell doing needlework, Grace remembered giving her testimony in court. She said that James McDermott had thrown Nancy Montgomery into the cellar. Grace was only a witness to this crime. However, in court, and later in the mental hospital, all her words were twisted. Only now, after meeting Dr. Jordan, does Grace feel that all her words are right. She can say anything, and the doctor will still be an unbiased listener. For the first time in many years, Grace feels as if she has awakened. Dr. Jordan thinks a lot about his new patient. When he dozed off, the landlady who brought him breakfast fainted. Simon brought Mrs. Humphrey to her senses, asking where her maid was. The woman replied that she could no longer pay the servants because her husband had left, taking all their money. There was no food left in the house. Since her husband left, Mrs. Humphrey hadn't eaten once. Dr. Jordan bought a lot of food for the woman. She didn't know how to thank him. Simon also intended to pay all the expenses for 2 months in advance so that Mrs. Humphrey would have time to sort things out. The woman kissed his hand. After breakfast, the doctor was ready to continue his session with Grace, who was mending lace. The first thing Simon asked Grace was whether she had dreams. Grace thought for a long time before answering that she didn't remember her dreams. After that, Dr. Jordan suggested that the patient continue from where they had left off yesterday. Grace recalled how the house's mistress, Mrs. Parkinson, was preparing to receive guests and ordered the maids to tidy up. Mary was very democratic and sharp-tongued. The girl was angry that some people had everything while others had pennies. The rebellion could change that. Grace wasn't as brave. In the evening before bed, the girls were fortune-telling. Grace thinks it's too early for her to think about marriage, while Mary dreams of marrying a young farmer with a big house. According to the fortune telling, Grace's future husband's name would start with the letter J, while Mary would never marry. The girl called it a silly old superstition and suggested her friend gossip. At night, both girls couldn't sleep for a long time. The next day Grace saw the famous local peddler, Jeremiah Pontelli. Grace was just in need of a new dress. The maids looked at all the goods offered by Jeremiah Pontelli: outfits, perfume, jewelry and scarves. They were delighted with all these trinkets. Jeremiah, who once performed as a magician at fairs, entertained the girls. Grace bought 4 buttons, and the merchant, enchanted by the girl's beauty, gave her a 5th one for good luck. Jeremiah also foretold Grace's future, saying she would cross the ocean 3 times and endure many hardships, but everything would end well. In her new dress, Grace was simply unrecognizable. That night, Grace woke up in pain and, against Mary's warning, went to the outdoor toilet. Hearing footsteps, Grace was frightened, but it was only Mary who said it was dangerous to be out at night. Dr. Jordan asked Grace why it was forbidden to go to the outdoor toilet at night. Grace replied that a girl always needs to be on guard. Mary had taught her that. In the past, one morning, seeing blood, Grace screamed in fear, thinking she had been struck by her mother's illness. Mary calmed her friend, saying it was a normal process for any woman and that it happened once a month. Mary lent Grace her petticoat and explained what needed to be done. Grace was immensely grateful to her friend. No one had ever taken care of her like that before. Grace is a beauty, and soon she will have many suitors. Mary advised her friend to be careful because men are liars by nature. During the day, the girls were doing their chores and fooled around. When Mary pretended to be unconscious to scare the friend, Grace asked her not to do that again. Later, the Parkinsons' eldest son, George, arrived at the house and began flirting with the maids. The house was undergoing preparations for the upcoming Christmas. The servants decorated the rooms. In the evening, Grace gave Mary a beautiful pincushion she had made herself. Mary said she would keep it forever. She also had a special gift for Grace, a neckerchief that Mary's mother had given her before she passed away. Mary had no one closer than Grace, so she wanted this neckerchief to belong to her now. A Christmas dinner was held at the Parkinsons' house. Many guests gathered. Seeing how her son looked at Mary, Mrs. Parkinson told the maid to go right away to mend the dresses. The guests partied all night. It was the happiest Christmas of Grace's life. George fell slightly ill, so he stayed home longer than usual. Mary took care of George, despite Mrs. Parkinson's instructions that none of the servants should disturb him. Even after George recovered, he didn't rush back to college. He was surrounded by attention and care, and he enjoyed it. Mrs. Parkinson didn't like her son's flirtation with the maids. Grace was equally concerned about her friend's response to George's flirting. Since then, Mary distanced herself from Grace, which greatly saddened the latter. Over the weekend, the Parkinsons went ice skating while the maids continued their routine chores. Grace directly asked her friend what was wrong. Mary tried to pretend everything was fine, but she suddenly felt nauseous. Mary asked Grace to forget about it. During the night, Mary continued to feel nauseous. Grace already suspected what was happening, as she had often seen her mother in such a state before. Barely holding back tears, Mary revealed that a man had promised to marry her and even gave her a ring. Mary wanted to believe her beloved was different, but he broke his promise. The girl couldn't tell the name of that man, but she knew one thing: as soon as her misfortune was known, she would be immediately kicked out of the house. Mary couldn't imagine how she would be able to feed herself and her child. Grace promised the friend that she would always be there for her. However, Grace, like Mary, was powerless to do anything about it. The only way out of the situation was to try to appeal to the man's conscience. If he was decent, he wouldn't turn his back on his child. The next day, with determination, Mary was ready to talk to her beloved. The other maids had already noticed that Mary had gained weight. Grace anxiously waited for her friend. As expected, Mary's beloved did not accept her pregnancy. He only gave her $5 and said he doubted his paternity. If the truth came out, this man would deny everything and ruin Mary's reputation. Grace hugged her crying friend, who said she truly loved this man, but now it was all over. Mary decided to find a doctor who usually helps fallen women in trouble. Grace had never heard of such doctors before, but she gave her savings to her friend without hesitation. Mary knows she might not survive this procedure, so she bequeathed all her belongings to Grace, who was horrified to hear this. The girls arrived at the right address and handed the money to the doctor. Of course, this was illegal. Mary tried to persuade Grace to leave, but she refused to leave her friend alone and waited outside the room. In the present, recalling it, Grace cannot utter a word. She remembers the screams behind the locked door. When it was all over, Grace hugged Mary and led her away. Mary was suffering from pain and couldn't work. Grace wanted to stay by her side, but she had to do chores for both of them. In the present, Grace tells Simon that she undoubtedly considered Mary's action a sin, but she couldn't blame her for it. Mary was merely a hostage to circumstances. Time passed, but Mary's pain did not subside. Grace wanted to call a doctor, but Mary stopped her, saying that no one should know what had happened. To distract herself from the pain, Mary asked Grace to tell a story. All the good stories Grace had heard were from Mary, so she told one of them. Grace slept on the floor so her friend would be more comfortable. In the morning, seeing pale and cold Mary, Grace was so shocked that couldn't scream. The other maids knocked on the door because Grace and Mary were already late. When the women entered and saw lifeless Mary on the bed, they were horrified and, telling Grace to stay here, ran to fetch the mistress. Grace still hoped that Mary would wake up, but no miracle happened. Mrs. Parkinson, who entered the room, could not believe that such a disgrace had taken place in her house. Grace did not deny that she knew about Mary's pregnancy and told the mistress that Mary had been betrothed to a certain gentleman who had deceived her. Grace does not know the name of this man. All Mary had told her was that the truth would not have pleased Mrs. Parkinson. The woman decided that it would be better for everyone if no one knew how Mary had passed away. They would say that she had suffered from a fever. In the present, Grace tells Simon that at that moment, she felt that Mary's soul could not find peace. She was ruined by the doctor and the unknown gentleman. Criminals do not always bear responsibility for their actions. Mrs. Parkinson ordered that Mary's body and the bed be put in order. The maid set to work. Grace opened the window to let Mary's soul out. Thus Grace lost the closest person to her once again. While washing the sheets, she fainted. The other maids tried to bring her to her senses, but she did not wake up. In the evening, the maids arranged a small farewell for Mary. Grace didn't wake up until the morning. She was disoriented, thinking she was Mary and calling for Grace. While the maids tried to calm her down, the girl kept repeating that Grace was lost. In the end, she lost consciousness again. Grace only woke up a day later. Now she understands that Mary is gone. As the fortune-telling predicted, she was never meant to marry. Grace never remembered what she did or said when she came to consciousness. It frightened her. Grace kept Mary's gift, the neckerchief. Thus ended the happiest time of her life. Grace and Simon's conversation was interrupted by a young lady, Miss Lydia, who asked if they needed anything. Grace decided they should call it a day. Simon thanked the patient for her candor. But he couldn't get into the darkest corners of Grace's soul, where even she couldn't go. Simon watched as the guards were taking Grace back to prison, treating her rather roughly. The doctor still did not know what was truth and what was lies. Was Grace really guilty? Simon reviewed the court reports and learned that during her time in the mental hospital, Grace behaved very aggressively, constantly screaming. She remembered the events leading up to the fatal incident in detail and almost nothing after it. Simon discussed this with Reverend Veringer. In addition to everything else, the doctor was concerned by the fact that when Mary passed away under terrible circumstances, Grace allegedly heard her voice. The Reverend was not at all surprised. He often encountered people who in grief heard the voices of those dear to them. Simon decided not to rush to conclusions about Grace's mental state. Mrs. Humphrey thanked Dr. Jordan for agreeing to prepare dinner. He was much more caring than her husband. Hearing Grace sing, Simon imagined kissing her. Could he be in love with his own patient? Simon complimented Grace's singing and said he saw the prison guards treating her roughly yesterday. Simon promised to talk to the prison warden about it. Grace noticed that the doctor looked tired, meaning he hadn't slept all night. Simon suggested they continue the session. Grace remembered the day of Mary's funeral. She was in Grace's best shirt and looked like a bride. At the pauper's cemetery, the priest conducted a funeral service. There were few people at the funeral, mostly the servants. Surprisingly, Jeremiah Pontelli also came. Grace was glad that Mary was buried properly. Jeremiah expressed his condolences. Grace could not come to terms with the loss of Mary. In the house, Mrs. Parkinson directly asked the maid who the father of Mary's child was. Grace assured that she didn't know. Mrs. Parkinson asked Grace to keep silent, even if she knew the truth, and raised her wages. Grace had no choice but to accept it. George was in no hurry to return to college in the United States. After Grace set the table, he followed her into the corridor. Scared, Grace dropped the tray. George expressed his condolences about Mary. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Parkinson. George left silently, and his mother advised Grace to be careful. At night, George came to Grace's room, but the door was locked. George persistently jiggled the door handle, while Grace remained unresponsive. She knew that one day the lock wouldn't stop him. And whatever happened, a woman was always to blame. One day Nancy from Richmond Hill visited the Parkinsons' house. She was going into town to buy fabrics. Grace asked Nancy how long she would be here. Nancy said she was a housekeeper at Thomas Kinnear's house. Her master was a noble Scotsman, and he was looking for a new maid. When Nancy offered Grace the job, she hesitated. Nancy began to persuade her, saying that Mr. Kinnear was a very generous employer. Moreover, he wasn't married, so there was no strict mistress in the house. When Nancy offered Grace a raise in wages, she considered it a more than generous offer and decided to accept. Nancy promised Grace that she would pay for her carriage to the estate and meet her personally. When Nancy left, the cook Sally told Grace that it was a bad idea. Mr. Kinnear's house was not the best place for a young woman. Since Sally, who didn't want to spread gossip, didn't say anything specific, Grace never understood what she meant. Grace was full of apprehension, but Nancy Montgomery reminded her so much of Mary that Grace dismissed all doubts. She still hadn't recovered from the loss of her best friend. Gathering her few belongings, Grace set off the next morning. She had a traveling companion, a man who drank and talked a lot during the entire trip. Grace remained silent to avoid any trouble. Upon arriving in Richmond Hill, the man offered Grace a whiskey with him, grabbing her by the elbow. The girl was defended by her employer Thomas Kinnear, who came to meet the new maid in person. Grace was surprised that Mr. Kinnear allowed her to sit at the front of the wagon. Thomas kindly offered her his hand. Grace had never sat next to a gentleman before and felt like a society lady. Simon was eager to know the details. Grace said that she tried not to stare at Thomas Kinnear because it would have been impolite. In the estate's garden, she saw Nancy in a pretty pink dress. Thomas Kinnear introduced Grace to Jamie Walsh, who lived nearby and sometimes helped out on the farm and with other chores. Almost immediately Grace began to regret leaving Toronto because Nancy didn't even bother to greet her. She only instructed McDermott to take the maid's belongings to her room. At that moment Grace's heart turned to ice. In the present, whenever she closes her eyes, she sees that house in minute detail. She remembers every room by heart. Ironically, of all the inhabitants of the house, 6 months after Grace's arrival, only she would remain alive. Later, Nancy showed her the yard and the house, including the cellar. At that moment Grace thought it was very strange that the cellar was not in the kitchen. Then Nancy showed Grace her new room. Grace noticed Nancy's gold earrings, which were clearly not bought with a housekeeper's salary. It was immediately clear that Nancy and McDermott did not get along. Nancy was sure that this gloomy guy would end up in a ditch. The housekeeper gave the new maid time to rest and allowed her to start her duties the next day. Grace always liked waking up earlier than everyone else. That way she could at least pretend for a moment that this house belonged to her. McDermott was constantly flirting with Grace, but she wasn't interested. One day Grace heard Nancy playing the piano. She was surprised that the housekeeper could play, but of course she kept silent. After that, according to Grace, life went on as usual. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. At least for a while. One day when Grace was milking a cow in the barn, she heard the sound of quick footsteps upstairs. Going up, she saw McDermott dancing. The man noticed her too but said nothing, just smiled. After that, Grace as usual washed the night potties and went about the rest of her daily duties. The next morning, Grace made tea and was about to take it to Mr. Kinnear. Usually Nancy did this, even though carrying trays was not part of a housekeeper's duties. Thomas Kinnear thanked Grace for the tea and asked for a fried egg for breakfast. She felt uneasy being in the master's chambers. While Grace was cooking the eggs, Nancy announced that she would have breakfast with Mr. Kinnear because he didn't like eating alone. Grace found it odd that Thomas Kinnear, being a respectable gentleman, had never married. Nancy said that not all self-sufficient people strive for marriage. After breakfast, Nancy began criticizing the maid's work, saying that she had arranged things in Mr. Kinnear's chambers incorrectly. Everything Grace did displeased Nancy. Thomas Kinnear liked that despite her young age and uneducated, Grace was curious. Naturally Nancy was jealous. Moreover, Thomas expressed his displeasure to Nancy about one of his clean shirts missing a button. Thomas said that such a thing should not happen again. Later, while Grace was doing laundry, McDermott returned, and Nancy told him that he had not cleaned her shoes properly. This made the young man furious. Nancy approached Grace and suggested they have tea together. The maid said she needed to finish the laundry first because it could start raining at any moment. Jamie said a nice hello to Grace, and before going to town for groceries, asked if she needed anything. During lunch in the servants' dining room, Grace asked McDermott about his life before working for Kinnear. McDermott said he had always been a slacker and hated serving the rich. McDermott didn't know if his mother was still alive, and he didn't care. Many years ago she had cursed him, wishing to burn in hell. What bothers McDermott the most is not that he serves a rich man, but that he is forced to obey a woman. Few people here like Nancy. When the guy started making explicit hints to Grace, she made it clear that she wasn't interested. Thomas was always very kind to Grace and admired her diligence. The girl was clearly flattered by this. When Mr. Kinnear left to visit his friend, Nancy shared with Grace that Thomas was not as impeccable as he might seem. He had almost been exiled to the colonies a long time ago. The reasons could be trivial, like a monetary debt or women. Nancy doesn't like the cellar because it smells of earth and mice. Grace, on the other hand, has gotten used to it. Grace found herself often unable to take her eyes off McDermott. She pretended not to look at him, and he pretended not to notice. When Grace went to the kitchen to fetch beer at Nancy's request, McDermott followed her and apologized for his morning rudeness. He was used to dealing with men and had forgotten all about manners. Grace said that even the Bible calls for forgiveness. Nancy loves musical evenings and often asks Jamie to play the flute. That evening, Jamie caught fireflies in the garden to delight Grace. The maid was surprised when Nancy asked her to stay with her tonight. In Kinnear's absence, Nancy was afraid to be alone. As Grace left, she turned and met McDermott's gaze. In the present in prison, Grace watched as another inmate was punished for taking an extra piece of bread. After breakfast, the guards came for Grace. Dr. Jordan constantly thought about this extraordinary woman. When the prison guards brought Grace, Simon said that he had just read McDermott's confession, in which he claimed that Grace hated Nancy, who fancied herself a lady though she was no higher in station than they were. Grace had already heard this at the trial. She decided to continue from where she had left off yesterday. In the past, Nancy had asked Grace to help with the brushing. Grace said her best friend had hair like that. Guests were expected today. Mr. Kinnear was due to arrive in the evening with his friends Captain Bridgeford and Captain Boyd. Their wives would not come because they would never deign to visit here. At Nancy's request, Grace searched for McDermott to have him kill a chicken for dinner. However, McDermott was nowhere to be found. Jamie said he was probably drinking in town. Grace went to Nancy and said she couldn't find McDermott. Nancy ordered the maid to handle the chicken herself. Grace pleaded with the housekeeper to assign her any other task, but Nancy was adamant. She pushed the maid, telling her not to return without the carcass. Grace almost cried, knowing she couldn't harm a living creature. Jamie gladly agreed to help her. Grace thanked him for his kindness. While preparing dinner, Nancy advised Grace to take a closer look at Jamie. However, Grace didn't consider him a suitable partner because he was too young. Since Nancy was afraid of spiders, she asked the maid to go to the cellar for wine. In the evening, Thomas Kinnear and his friends drank, talked about women and reminisced about quelling the rebellion against the government. People like Thomas had deprived Mary Whitney's family of everything, but of course Grace would never voice this to her master. Nancy preferred not to think about politics. The only thing that bothered her now was that she had gotten very fat lately. In the morning, Grace had the honor of attending church service with Mr. Kinnear and Nancy. Grace no longer tried to think about what was sinful and what was not. She had no control over her own life anyway. The priest's words during the service made Grace sleepy. An elderly lady whispered that it was a disgrace, after which Nancy suggested leaving. All these people believe that God sees them only on Sundays when they put on a mask of piety. But God is everywhere. At home, Nancy scolded McDermott for his unauthorized absence the previous day. Nancy fired him, allowing him to work here only for the rest of the month. McDermott got drunk, saying he was even glad about the situation because he didn't want to work for a fallen woman anymore. Grace asked what he meant. McDermott said that Nancy was Kinnear's mistress. In the past, she had an illegitimate affair with some farmer, so no self-respecting man would hire her. But Kinnear did. Grace didn't want to believe it, although deep down she knew McDermott was telling the truth. Grace felt ashamed to be in such company. From then on, she began to notice that Mr. Kinnear treated Nancy not as a simple housekeeper. In Grace's eyes, Nancy had lost all respect as a housekeeper, so the maid began to often be insolent to her. In response to another insolence, Grace received a slap. Thomas began to show interest not only in Nancy but also in Grace, helping her. Seeing this, Nancy was furious. McDermott knows that Nancy will not pay him for this month. Moreover, he is sure that Grace will face the same fate. Heavily drunk, McDermott suggested to Grace that they get rid of Kinnear and Nancy, who are poisoning their lives. Grace did not take his words seriously. Her father when drunk often made such threats too, but it never went beyond words. Simon knows that before his execution, McDermott insisted that it was Grace who was the instigator of the crime. She tried to persuade him to add poison to the porridge, while he refused. Grace denies this. If she had wanted to poison the porridge, she would not have needed accomplices. Simon thought that there was some logic in her words. When the doctor asked Grace if she often felt lonely, she replied that she did, especially in the mental hospital and in prison when she was punished. In the past for Grace's birthday, Nancy gave her flowers and relieved from work duties until lunchtime. Grace was bewildered by such kindness from the housekeeper. McDermott offered to keep Grace company, but she refused. The girl walked in the garden and picked flowers, not knowing where to go. At that moment Grace felt a sharp loneliness. She had no prospects but to work from dawn to dusk. Her solitude was interrupted by Jamie, who gave her a bouquet of wildflowers. Jamie noticed that the girl was sad. Grace admitted that she had no one close. When Jamie proposed to Grace, she promised to think about it. Jamie was younger than her, but when he saved up some money, they could run away together. To cheer the girl up, Jamie wove a wreath for her. This sweet red-haired guy truly brightened Grace's birthday. When she returned to the house, Mr. Kinnear asked who she had been walking with in the garden. Grace admitted that it was her birthday today and that Jamie just wanted to make her happy. Seeing a wilted flower in Grace's hair, Nancy said it looked silly. Grace silently went about her duties. Nancy showed her displeasure in every way. Upon learning about Grace's walk with Jamie in the garden, McDermott reacted aggressively. He'd like to teach the young man a lesson. More than anything, Grace wanted to be alone at that moment, but she was not given such an opportunity. Dr. Jordan asked what feelings this caused in her. Grace replied that it made her angry. But when she saw Jeremiah Pontelli through the window, she was very happy and invited him into the house. Grace was delighted to meet someone from her past. Jeremiah shared that he had given up his nomadic life and wanted to become a hypnotist. He didn't consider it a scam because people believe what they want to believe. Jeremiah was sure that Grace was not safe here. Kinnear had a bad reputation because of his relationships with the maids. Nancy used to be a simple maid too, doing all the hard work like Grace does now. Grace didn't know this. When Jeremiah suggested she run away with him, it was a very tempting offer. Grace could be free. She thought Jeremiah wanted to marry her, but it turned out that marriage was not part of his plans. Grace didn't want to repeat Mary's fate, so she refused him. Their conversation was interrupted by McDermott, who said that the master would be very angry if he found out that his maid was wasting beer and cheese on some wandering peddler. Grace said goodbye to Jeremiah Pontelli. McDermott was clearly jealous. A few days later a doctor visited the house, which was never a good sign. Nancy was sick, so Grace took over some of her duties. Nancy didn't like this, so despite feeling unwell, she couldn't allow Grace to bring coffee to Mr. Kinnear instead of her. Moreover, Nancy loaded Grace with extra work, making her scrub the floors. But despite all of Nancy's efforts, Thomas Kinnear continued to show interest in Grace. This made Nancy angrier, and she ordered the maid to alter her dresses. Nancy could no longer fit into the old ones. At that moment, Grace realized the cause of Nancy's ailment. It was obvious that she was pregnant. Grace's heart clenched. Nancy was in trouble, just like Mary once was. Simon asked Grace if Mr. Kinnear knew about Nancy's pregnancy. Grace doubted that he did. Grace didn't wish Nancy harm but didn't want to see her as a noble lady either because Mary had passed away under similar circumstances. In Grace's opinion, one woman shouldn't be punished while another is rewarded for the same sin. In the evening there was a severe thunderstorm. During dinner, McDermott complained about having to eat porridge and bread while the masters ate meat. Grace was tired of listening to his whining. As Grace was leaving, she overheard Nancy talking to Mr. Kinnear about her problems with the servants. McDermott was lazy, and Grace had been cheeky lately. Nancy was thinking of firing her too. When Thomas started saying that if Grace were dressed in a beautiful gown and taught aristocratic manners, she could easily pass for a lady, Nancy didn't like it. Thomas had never given her such flattering compliments. He needed something else from her. At night, Grace couldn't fall asleep for a long time. The rain was loud and oppressive. She heard whispers and then had a strange dream. First she walked through the Kinnear house, then found herself in the garden. There, Grace was surrounded by all the men who had ever shown her attention. In the trees she saw lost angels. In the morning, Grace discovered that her feet were covered in dirt. It turned out she had been sleepwalking. The wind had blown the sheets away during the night, and they hung in the trees, resembling lost angels. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the house was cursed. At that moment, she regretted not running away with Jeremiah Pontelli, but now she didn't know where he was. In the present, Grace feels Dr. Simon's interest in her. At night in her cell, she lay awake thinking about the conclusions the doctor might come to. He was also awake. The next day, Simon reread Grace's testimony, which claimed that it was McDermott who had pushed Nancy into the cellar and taken her life. McDermott, however, insisted that they had done it together. Grace watched coldly as McDermott did all the dirty work, getting rid of the evidence. In the evening, Simon walked with Reverend Veringer, telling him about his success in the sessions with Grace. Perhaps together they could restore her memory of that day. The Reverend in turn advised the doctor to find another house for temporary lodging. If anyone found out it was just him and the landlady, it could damage his reputation. Simon said he would think about it. That same night, Mrs. Humphrey came to his room because she supposedly heard some noise. Simon asked the woman to stop it. During the day at the prison governor's house, Grace talked with the ladies from the spiritualist circle. Some were afraid of Grace, while others were not. The maid mentioned that Dr. Jordan was taking care of the woman whose room he was renting because her husband had left. They even had breakfast together. For some reason this made Grace worried. Later, Simon told the hosts and their guests about the phenomenon of amnesia. Perhaps his research could make a breakthrough in this field. After the lecture, Simon was introduced to Dr. Jérôme Dupont, who said it was enlightening. Simon did not know that the man in front of him was Jeremiah Pontelli. The voice of Dr. Jordan's interlocutor seemed familiar to Grace, but she had no opportunity to see his face yet. Jeremiah Pontelli, under the guise of Dr. DuPont, asked Dr. Jordan for permission to work with a patient personally, to apply his new neurohypnosis technique. But Simon had to refuse, as it might undermine a week's worth of his work. Also gathered in this house are those who believe in Grace's innocence. They hoped that the court would reconsider its decision after Dr. Jordan's verdict. Upon seeing Jeremiah, Grace fainted with a tray in her hands. Simon brought her to her senses. She could not believe that Jeremiah Pontelli was really in front of her. He had pulled off the biggest scam of his life. He continued to play his role, offering Grace a hypnosis session. Grace played along, pretending they didn't know each other. Simon decided that there had been enough shocks for one day and led Grace away. He did not want to subject Grace to a dubious hypnosis technique. At night in her cell, Grace thought about what she would tell Dr. Jordan tomorrow. The denouement was near. Earlier at the trial, Grace had denied her guilt. She had not told Dr. Jordan that shortly before the fateful day, Nancy had fired her. Did Grace cry? Of course. McDermott hugged her, trying to comfort her. Grace pushed him away. McDermott said he could share a secret with her if she promised to keep silent. Now Grace no longer understands if that really happened. She does not exactly remember what happened to Nancy, but she remembers how Thomas Kinnear was looking for her throughout the house at night because he wanted to have fun. Maybe none of this actually happened either. Lies and truth had become confused in Grace's mind. Morning came. Today Grace will finish her story, whatever the ending may be. Simon eagerly awaits their meeting. When he arrived at the prison governor's house, Grace was already there. Her story reached the point where she needed to reveal what had happened. Simon reminded her that he was a doctor, not a judge. He did not care if Grace was guilty. Simon just wanted to know what she remembered. That morning, Mr. Kinnear was going to leave until Friday. Seeing the maid stroking the master's horse, Nancy disapprovingly told her to get back to work. When Dr. Jordan asked if Mr. Kinnear had behaved inappropriately with her, Grace did not want to answer. Simon apologized to her. He truly did not want to awaken unpleasant feelings in Grace. When the master left, Nancy told the maid to get out of the house by tomorrow. Grace would get her wages, but that would be all. She doesn't believe that Mr. Kinnear knew about it. To some extent Grace understands Nancy, who was expecting an illegitimate child. Nancy decided to kick the maid out before she could take the mistress's place in the house. McDermott was in exactly the same situation as Grace. He was sure that Nancy wouldn't pay them and wouldn't give them good references. At that moment, McDermott revealed to Grace his intentions to get rid of Nancy and rob the Kinnear house. And Grace would help him with it. In the present, Grace tells the doctor that she didn't argue with McDermott. That didn't mean she didn't believe him. Grace wasn't exactly sure what was driving her, especially since by then they had both already had 2 shots of whiskey. However, Grace managed to talk McDermott out of doing it that night. If they did it in the early morning, there would be less suspicion. In the end McDermott agreed with her. Simon asked the patient to continue her story. She recounted that Nancy acted as if nothing had happened, as if they were friends. She always did that. Moreover, Nancy asked the maid to stay with her tonight because she was afraid of robbers. McDermott changed his mind, deciding to carry out the plan at night. That way he wouldn't have to see Nancy's eyes. The housekeeper decided that they would sleep in Kinnear's chambers. Unable to bear it, Grace told her about McDermott's plans, but Nancy didn't take it seriously. She was sure McDermott was just bragging. Grace reassured herself that she had done everything she could to save Nancy. That night she slept poorly, seeing Mary's ghost in the room. Grace opened the window to let her friend's soul out, but the vision suddenly disappeared. That night would be Nancy's last. Grace would often have nightmares about it afterwards. This was one of the reasons she was kept in a mental hospital. McDermott was so nervous that he waited until morning after all. Grace still thought he wasn't capable of it. McDermott took it as an insult, intending to prove to Grace that he wasn't a coward. She begged him not to do it right in Kinnear's chambers. Later while Grace was working in the garden, McDermott took an axe. She didn't stop him, hearing the sounds of struggle. What happened next Grace doesn't remember. Or at least that's what she claims. Dr. Jordan was reading Grace's confession, in which she described how McDermott threw Nancy into the cellar. Grace insists that she was forced to say this in court. Maybe it really happened that way, or maybe it didn't. Grace also doesn't remember handing McDermott her neckerchief for him to finish what he started. When Thomas Kinnear returned, McDermott realized he had no choice but to take his life as well. Grace tried to dissuade McDermott, but he was determined. Thomas didn't suspect anything and was in a good mood. McDermott called him to the stable under the pretext of looking at a new saddle. At some point McDermott fired a shot. Dragging lifeless Thomas into the house, he ordered Grace to open the cellar. Grace didn't want to be an accomplice to the crime and ran away. McDermott fired after her but missed. However, out of fear, Grace fainted and only regained consciousness later. From the report, Simon knows that Jamie Walsh arrived at Kinnear's house by 8 in the morning. This was after Grace's fainting. In his testimony, Jamie noted that both McDermott and Grace were in a good mood. She was wearing new white stockings, Nancy's stockings. Later, Jamie would testify against Grace in court. His infatuation with her was gone. Jamie's testimony became the main evidence against Grace. She was sentenced to execution. Upon hearing the verdict, she fainted. She even has a scar from it. Simon realized that Grace was tired and suggested continuing the conversation tomorrow. Grace hopes that the doctor will help her find out the truth and get the relief she has been waiting for all these years. Simon is filled with conflicting feelings. Later, he dined with Reverend Veringer at the tavern. Simon doesn't know if Grace is sick or just faking amnesia. Maybe she's just skillfully manipulating all of them. The Reverend thought they should agree to Jérôme Dupont's proposal to conduct a hypnosis session, but Simon doesn't trust that man. All night he studied the police reports again. According to the official version, after getting rid of Nancy and Thomas, McDermott and Grace began collecting all the valuable items in the house. Around 11 in the evening, they took a horse-drawn wagon and left for Toronto, planning to elope to America and get married. In the morning, Mrs. Humphrey begged him not to leave, but Simon said he needed to go to Toronto for work. On the train, Simon looked thoughtful. Today he didn't meet with Grace, so she will have to continue without him. She has time to think about what to say when the doctor returns. There are two versions of those events, hers and McDermott's. According to his version, when he brought Grace to her senses, she was glad to see him. They drank whiskey, celebrating the success of their plan, and then fled. Grace doesn't believe she could have been so heartless. However, she was wearing Nancy's clothes. During their journey, she prayed to God to forgive her. But what if an all-forgiving God doesn't exist? McDermott said he had sold his soul to the devil for Grace. It was at her request that he took the lives of Nancy and Kinnear. Now it's impossible to say for sure who was lying. They decided to stop at a hotel. Now McDermott had money, so he could pay for everything. Grace still couldn't believe they had done it. At some point she realized that she had lost her neckerchief. McDermott reminded her that the kerchief had been left in the cellar where Nancy was. Grace didn't dare to argue. Now they had to stick together, or it would be the end for them. At one point Grace even wanted to call for help, but that would be a betrayal to McDermott, so she remained silent. They boarded a steamboat to America. Grace introduced herself to everyone as Mary Whitney. It seemed that in a foreign land no one would find them. Though they were not yet married, McDermott demanded the fulfillment of marital duties, but each time Grace refused him. Their freedom didn't last long. One night the police came for them. In the present, Dr. Jordan met with Grace's former lawyer. The man had also represented McDermott in court but managed to get a reduced sentence only for Grace. Unlike McDermott, she could transfer all the blame onto him without harm to herself. Dr. Jordan confessed that he still hasn't determined if Grace is sane. Sometimes he can't shake the feeling that she's lying to him. The lawyer said that Grace might have her own motives. Maybe she tells all these stories to keep the young, single doctor around her as long as possible. The lawyer himself went through this. Before the trial, he spent a lot of time in Grace's cell, and she became obsessed with him. Simon didn't like what he heard. The lawyer doesn't hide that he initially believed Grace was guilty and still thinks so. In her cell, Grace wonders why the doctor went to Toronto. If he hoped to get answers there about her guilt, he would be disappointed. The next day they met again. Seeing that Grace's hair was cut, Simon asked what had happened. Grace replied that it was her punishment for talking. Simon decided it was time to try other methods to restore her memory. Simon intends to agree to Mr. Dupont's suggestion to conduct a hypnosis session. Grace said she was ready to go through with it if it would truly help. Now Grace is leafing through the scrapbook of Lydia, a young lady who has feelings for Simon. The doctor asked Grace what she would include in her own scrapbook. She mentioned several things, including the neckerchief. Simon wanted to end the conversation, saying they would continue tomorrow. Grace is cleaning the prison governor's house. More than anything, she wants to be heard, and Dr. Jordan is the only one who can help her. Dr. Dupont, aka Jeremiah Pontelli, was preparing to conduct a hypnosis session for Grace. He assured that it was a proven scientific method and that Grace would simply fall asleep listening to his voice. Finally, Jeremiah began the session, saying aloud how Grace's eyelids were getting heavy and she was feeling drowsy. Grace played along with her old acquaintance, feigning a hypnotic sleep and answering the pseudo-doctor's questions. When Jeremiah asked the patient to raise her hand, he told Grace that her hand was now like unbendable steel. To demonstrate this, the pseudo-doctor attempted to bend the patient's arm, pretending to apply maximum effort. When the audience was convinced that Grace was truly under hypnosis, Jeremiah Pontelli announced that it was now possible to delve into the past. Dr. Jordan asked Jeremiah to question the subject about the Kinnear house. Grace responded that she saw flowers in the sunset. Simon wanted Grace to imagine entering the house and heading towards the cellar. One of the ladies in the audience felt uneasy. She seemed to sense the presence of a ghost. Dr. DuPont reminded everyone that this was hypnosis, not spiritualism. When asked if she had a relationship with McDermott, Grace replied that they often met in the yard. McDermott was in her power, as was Mr. Kinnear. The ladies present were embarrassed to hear such indecent details. To defuse the situation, Jeremiah asked Grace to recall the cellar again. She described the cellar in great detail. Grace openly recounted how she helped McDermott get rid of Nancy. Grace screamed that Nancy deserved it because sin must be punished. Everyone present, who had believed in Grace's innocence all these years, was shocked. Had she been deceiving them all this time? Or had they deceived themselves? Suddenly the girl declared that she was not Grace but Mary Whitney. It was Mary who had given Grace the neckerchief, which later became the instrument of the crime. The one claiming to be Mary insisted that Grace knew nothing. Mary only occasionally borrowed Grace's earthly shell and convinced McDermott to get rid of Nancy. Mary also revealed that on the day of her demise, Grace forgot to open the window. Thus Mary's soul couldn't get out. Dr. Jordan was not convinced by this spectacle, unlike the others who were sure they had witnessed a spiritual seance. Dr. DuPont brought Grace out of hypnosis by snapping his fingers. Grace pretended to be disoriented, claiming that she had been sleeping and dreaming the whole time. After asking one of the ladies to take Grace to rest, the pseudo-doctor announced that he was confused because it seemed that two souls resided in Grace's body simultaneously. However, Dr. Jordan did not believe this, convinced that Grace was mocking them. The Reverend wanted to secure a pardon for her, but Simon would prefer not to write a report at all rather than lie. After what had happened in the prison governor's living room, Simon became interested in the phenomenon of hypnosis. Perhaps it was the only way for women to express what they truly thought. Since childhood, Grace had seen nothing good in life. This inevitably caused her to accumulate aggression within herself. The question is whether she could have released this aggression on Nancy Montgomery or Thomas Kinnear. Simon decided to leave Kingston forever and forget about Grace Marks. When Grace learned this from the Reverend, she was of course upset. However, in his letter, Simon promised to appeal to the authorities to release Grace from prison. Grace remembered how many years ago Jeremiah Pontelli read her palm. He predicted that she would go through many hardships, but in the end everything would turn out well. 2 years after his visit to Kingston, Simon drove himself to nervous exhaustion. The unsolved mystery tormented him. Simon often dreamt of finding the truth, which always eluded him in reality. 11 years later Grace received a pardon. Hearing this, she cried. The prison governor's wife embraced her. Grace didn't immediately get used to the idea that she was no longer a notorious murderess, but a woman who had once been unjustly accused. The prison had been her home for 30 years. Leaving its walls and heading into the unknown, she felt afraid. The prison governor and his wife made sure to arrange a job for Grace in a new home. They did not reveal the employer's name, only saying that it was the house of a gentleman who was an old friend of hers. Grace assumed it was Simon Jordan, but she was mistaken. It was Jamie Walsh. It was his testimony that had swayed the judge and jury against her. Jamie said that he had lived with unbearable guilt all these years, and now he wanted to earn Grace's forgiveness. She forgave him easily. Jamie had once been the son of a poor farmer, but he had achieved everything on his own and built a large house. Jamie immediately proposed to Grace, and she accepted. Grace finally found the free, peaceful life she had always dreamed of. Jamie suggested hiring a maid, but Grace preferred to do all the housework herself. She doesn't want another woman in their home. Grace knows that Jeremiah Pontelli will keep her secret, just as she keeps his. Every night before going to sleep, Jamie asks his wife for forgiveness for the years of her life she lost because of him. Grace always says that she forgives him, though this is a lie. However, it's far from the first lie in Grace's life. The encounter with Grace many years ago had affected Simon so much that he went to war, where he was seriously injured. The doctor was powerless to help. Simon, who can neither move nor speak, is cared for by his mother. She held a letter from Grace in her hands. Grace often thinks that this is a dream and that she is still in that cell. But this is reality. Lately she has been remembering Mary Whitney more and more. Finally, Grace finished sewing her patchwork quilt, choosing the pattern she wanted. Grace will always remember Mary and Nancy. Now they are connected. Simon's mother read him the letter from Grace. Her name escaped his lips. In the final scene, we see Grace completing her work on her patchwork quilt. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.